One day, without warning, the gods of Asgard awoke to a chilling silence. The laughter of Iunn, keeper of the golden apples of youth, was nowhere to be heard. The air itself seemed heavier, as if weighed down by dread. Where was she? Her absence sent a ripple of panic through the halls of the gods, for without Iunn's apples, their immortality would fade, and the entire order of the cosmos would unravel. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a catastrophe in the making. How could something so vital, so sacred, vanish without a trace? The kidnapping of Iunn Idun, the gentle goddess whose very presence ensured the eternal youth of the Aesir, is one of the most gripping tales in Norse mythology. It's a story of cunning deception, desperate searches, and the fragile balance between order and chaos. Imagine the terror of the gods as they realized their fate rested in the hands of a trickster, a giant, and a careless mistake. Who would dare steal the very heart of their power, and what would it take to bring her back before time itself began to wither the divine? This is more than just a myth, it's a story about vulnerability, betrayal, and the lengths we go to preserve what we hold dear. The gods, mighty as they were, found themselves powerless without Iunn's grace. And as we unravel this tale together, you'll see how even the smallest oversight can lead to disaster, how trust can be weaponized, and how the bonds of loyalty are tested in the face of desperation. So let's step into the shadows of Yggdrasil, the World Tree, and uncover the truth behind one of Norse mythology's most suspenseful abductions. The fate of Asgard hangs in the balance, and the answers are more astonishing than you might expect. Iunn Idun wasn't just another goddess in the halls of Asgard. She was the living breath of the gods, the silent force holding their divinity together. Imagine a vault of golden apples shimmering with otherworldly light, each one carrying the essence of eternal youth. That was her sacred duty, to guard and distribute these fruits, ensuring Odin, Thor, and all the Aesir remained untouched by time. Without her, their strength would fade, their wisdom would crumble, and the very foundation of the cosmos would tremble. But Iunn was more than a keeper of magical fruit. She was warmth and laughter in a realm often shadowed by war and prophecy. Married to Bragi, the silver-tongued god of poetry, their union wove together the vitality of youth and the power of storytelling. You might say they balanced each other perfectly. Where Bragi spun words to inspire, Iunn provided the literal immortality that let the gods keep hearing those tales. Here's the terrifying truth: the gods didn't just rely on her apples, they depended on them. Unlike the distant, untouchable deities of other myths, the Aesir were startlingly mortal in this way. Without Iunn's gifts, wrinkles would crease Odin's brow, Thor's muscles would weaken, and even Loki's cunning would dull with age. Her disappearance wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an existential crisis. And that's what makes her kidnapping so brilliant in its cruelty. Whoever took her didn't just steal a goddess, they stole time itself from the gods. They turned their greatest strength into a vulnerability. The apples weren't just food, they were the ticking clock counting down to Ragnarok. Every moment Iunn was gone, the gods could feel eternity slipping through their fingers like sand. No wonder they panicked, no wonder they'd risk anything to get her back. Before the shadow of fear fell over Asgard, the realm of the gods was a place of golden light and unshakable order. Each dawn began with the same sacred ritual. Iunn would emerge from her grove, her basket brimming with apples that shone like captured sunlight. The gods would gather, not just to receive their portion of immortality, but to bask in her quiet presence. There was comfort in this rhythm, a certainty that as long as Iunn walked among them, time itself would bow to their divinity. The great hall of Valhalla echoed with laughter and the clashing of mead horns, warriors and gods alike reveling in strength that never waned. Odin's ravens perched on his shoulders, whispering secrets of the 9 realms, while Thor's thunderous jokes shook the tables. Even Loki, ever the restless trickster, would pause to savor the crisp sweetness of his apple, knowing it was the only reason his schemes could stretch across centuries. But beneath the feasts and boasts lay a fragile truth: Asgard's glory was borrowed. Without those apples, the gods were like towering oak trees with roots barely clinging to the earth. Iunn's magic wasn't just a convenience, it was the invisible thread stitching their world together. The walls of Asgard stood tall because their guardians never aged. The wisdom of the gods remained sharp because their minds never dulled. Even the shimmering rainbow bridge Bifrost seemed to pulse brighter when Iunn passed by, as if her very step renewed the magic woven into its stones. Picture it, a paradise built on a single, silent agreement. The gods ruled, fought, and reveled, while one unassuming goddess held the key to it all in her hands. And in their arrogance, they never imagined that key could be stolen. Of all the gods in Asgard, none walked the line between ally and adversary quite like Loki. The flame-haired trickster, whose silver tongue could weave miracles or disasters with equal ease, was both the spark of laughter in Odin's hall and the ember of chaos smoldering beneath its foundations. His relationship with the Aesir was a tapestry of contradictions: sworn blood brother to Odin, companion to Thor on adventures, yet always the one whispering plans that danced just a little too close to disaster. The gods tolerated his mischief because his cleverness often saved them, but there was always a tension in the air when Loki lingered too long in the shadows. He'd already orchestrated Baldur's death with a mistletoe dart and once cut Sif's golden hair for spite, only to replace it with magic. Each time, his apologies were as smooth as honey, his reasons just plausible enough to keep his head attached to his shoulders. But trust, that was a currency Loki spent faster than he earned. So when a storm-haired giant named Thjazi cornered Loki far from Asgard's gates, pressing him for a way to strike at the god's immortality, the trickster's mind began its familiar, treacherous dance. Thjazi's demand was simple: bring him Iunn and her apples, or face a death far slower and more painful than any battle wound. Loki, ever the survivor, weighed his options. Betray the gods who scorned him but kept him fed and clothed, or defy a giant who could snap his spine like a twig. What happened next was pure Loki. He didn't refuse. He didn't confess. He spun a new scheme, one that would let him wriggle free while pretending loyalty to both sides. With a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, he whispered to Thjazi of a hidden grove where Iunn often walked alone, her basket heavy with fruit. Then he flew back to Asgard on borrowed wings, his mind already racing ahead to the chaos and the opportunities her disappearance would bring. Here's the cruel genius of it: Loki knew exactly what he was unleashing. The gods wouldn't just mourn Iunn, they'd unravel like fraying rope. Their panic would be his entertainment, their desperation his leverage. And if, by some twist of fate, he ended up playing the hero later, well, that would just prove his irreplaceable value, wouldn't it? That was Loki's true nature. Not purely evil, not wholly good, but a shifting shadow that always found a way to land on its feet. Even if the whole world had to stumble first, Thjazi was no ordinary giant. His name meant the Devourer, and his hunger wasn't just for power, but for the very essence of the gods themselves. Towering over mountains with eyes like frozen lakes, this storm-riding Jotun had watched from Jotunheim as the Aesir feasted on eternal youth while his own kin withered and aged. The bitter irony gnawed at him. Here were beings who claimed to be wise rulers, yet their immortality hinged on stolen magic plucked from branches they didn't sow. His plan wasn't born of brute force but cold calculation. Thjazi knew storming Asgard's gates would be suicide. Odin's spear and Thor's hammer had shattered far mightier giants. No, this required something subtler, a weakness to exploit, and when he spied Loki slinking between realms like a fox between henhouses, he saw his opening. The trickster had always been Asgard's loose thread, and Thjazi knew exactly how to pull. Cornering Loki in the twisted roots of Yggdrasil, where even Odin's ravens rarely flew, the giant offered no threats at first. Instead, he poured mead as dark as old blood and spoke of shared grievances. "Why should you scrape for scraps at their table," he murmured, "when your silver tongue could make kings of us both?" He dangled promises, realms reshaped, hierarchies overturned, but beneath the honeyed words lay steel. When Loki hesitated, Thjazi's voice dropped to a whisper colder than Niflheim's winds. "Or shall I tell Odin, whose lies let the wolf Fenrir slip his chains?" Here's what Thjazi understood that the gods often forgot. Loki's loyalty wasn't to thrones or oaths, but survival. Faced with a choice between immediate torture or future consequences, the trickster's resolve crumbled like autumn leaves. Yet true to form, Loki spun his compliance into another game. "I'll bring you Iunn," he said, grinning like a man holding aces, "but you'll need wings to reach her." And so the trap was set, not with ropes or chains, but desperation and deceit. Thjazi would wear the feathers of a mighty eagle, swooping down when Iunn strayed too far from Asgard's shields. Loki, ever the performer, would play the unwitting accomplice, his hands technically clean. But in his ice-blue eyes, the giant wasn't just stealing a goddess, he was stealing time. Let the Aesir feel their bones creak, their vision blur, their power leak away like mead from a cracked horn. Only then would they understand what it meant to be mortal. Only then would they kneel. Loki's silver tongue could charm the venom from a serpent's fangs, and that's exactly the weapon he wielded when he approached Iunn in her sunlit orchard. He found her humming softly, fingers brushing the golden apples that glowed like miniature suns in her woven basket. There was no hint of malice in his smile, just the playful mischief the gods had grown accustomed to. "You're the only one who hasn't seen the wonder I found beyond Asgard's walls," he murmured, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "Trees so ancient their roots touch the bones of the earth, their branches heavy with fruits that make ours look like pebbles. I'd wager even your apples would blush beside them." Iunn hesitated. She rarely ventured beyond the safety of Asgard's borders, but curiosity flickered in her eyes. Loki had always been a weaver of tall tales, but what if, just this once, he spoke truth? The other gods often dismissed her as meek, the quiet keeper of their immortality. Here was a chance to prove there was more to her, to discover something wondrous on her own. "Bring your apples," Loki added casually, already turning away. "Compare them, I'd love to hear your thoughts." It was the perfect bait, not a demand, but an invitation to share her expertise. The moment she stepped beyond the realm's protective barriers, the sky darkened as if the sun had been snuffed out. Thjazi, his eagle wings blotting out the light, plummeted from the clouds like a spear of ice. Iunn barely had time to gasp before talons the size of scythes clamped around her shoulders, her basket tumbling to the earth. The last thing she saw was Loki, still grinning, but now with a sharpness that cut deeper than Thjazi's claws. His betrayal wasn't just in the act, it was in the way he made her complicit in her own undoing. Back in Asgard, the effects were immediate. Thor reached for his hammer and found the handle slippery in his suddenly stiffened fingers. Odin's single eye blurred as wrinkles spiderwebbed across his brow. Without Iunn's apples, the gods didn't just feel weaker, they felt time for the first time, its weight pressing down like a millstone. The golden halls seemed dimmer, the feasts quieter, as if the realm itself was holding its breath. And somewhere in the shadows, Loki watched the chaos unfold, his laughter a silent ember in the growing dark. The first sign wasn't pain, it was a whisper. A tremor in Thor's grip as he lifted his hammer, the once effortless weight now straining his tendons. A stiffness in Odin's knees as he rose from his throne like hinges rusted shut. The gods of Asgard, who had never known the creak of aging bones or the fog of a weary mind, suddenly moved through their golden halls like ghosts haunting their own bodies. Heimdall's golden teeth ached in his gums. Freya's renowned beauty, once untouched by centuries, now showed threads of silver in her hair. The realization hit like an avalanche. Iunn was gone, and with her, the apples that had frozen time itself. Panic spread faster than wildfire. warriors in Valhalla, mid-laugh over mead, found their tankards slipping from fingers gone frail. The Einherjar, eternal in their vigor, clutched their swords with knuckles suddenly knotted with arthritis. Even Loki, who'd orchestrated the chaos, felt a prickle of unease as his own reflexes dulled proof that betrayal, once set in motion, spares no one. The air itself seemed thinner, as if Asgard's magic was unraveling thread by thread. Odin's response was swift and merciless, summoning the gods to the roots of Yggdrasil. His voice, usually a thunderclap of authority, now carried the rasp of an old man. "We are dying by degrees," he growled, his single eye scanning the gathered faces. "Every heartbeat without Iunn's apples is a knife scraping at the ropes that hold up the world." The Allfather's ravens, Hugin and Munin, brought no news from their flights, only the chilling silence of unanswered questions. But here's what made their desperation so visceral: the gods weren't just fading physically. Their very essence was crumbling. Odin's wisdom, hoarded over millennia, began to scatter like leaves in a storm. Thor's legendary temper cooled into something worse doubt. Without youth's fire, the Aesir became shadows of themselves, their divine certainty replaced by human frailty. The halls of Asgard, once ringing with boastful songs, now echoed with hushed conversations and the dry coughs of beings who'd never imagined they could grow sick. And in the midst of it all, one question burned hotter than Surtur's sword. Who had taken her? The gods turned on each other like wolves, accusations flying until Odin silenced them with a slam of Gungnir. "This is no accident," he said, the runes on his spear pulsing like a heartbeat. "This is theft, and thieves leave trails." His gaze, sharp as ever despite his withering body, landed on Loki, who stood just a little too still, his smile a little too hollow. The game was up, the reckoning was coming, and Asgard had never been closer to the brink. The halls of Asgard, once alive with the clamor of feasts and battles, now echoed with something far more unsettling: silence. The gods moved like shadows, their weakened bodies betraying them with every step, but their minds sharpened by a single, burning purpose: find Iunn before time itself turned against them. Odin's ravens scoured the 9 realms, their black wings slicing through mist and moonlight, while Thor's thunder rumbled not in challenge but in frustration, cracking the skies like a whip. The trail was cold, the scent of magic faint, until a whisper from an unlikely source broke the silence. A lone Völva, a seeress who dwelled in the roots of Yggdrasil, spoke of an eagle with wings darker than midnight, seen carrying a flicker of golden light toward the towering peaks of Jotunheim. The description sent a ripple of recognition through the gods. Thjazi. The name hung in the air like a curse, but eagles, even giant ones, didn't pluck goddesses from guarded realms without help. Eyes turned, slow and inevitable, toward Loki. The trickster had been unusually absent since Iunn's disappearance, his laughter conspicuously missing from the halls. When they finally cornered him near Bifrost, his grin was too wide, his words too smooth. "Why would I risk Odin's wrath?" he scoffed, tossing an apple core into the void, a careless gesture that felt like a slap. But gods noticed details. The fruit wasn't golden, it was ordinary. A tell. Frigg, her once radiant face now lined with worry, stepped forward, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet. "You were the last to speak with her, Loki, the last to walk beyond the gates." The accusation hung in the air, thick as Mead Hall smoke. For once, Loki's silver tongue failed him. His fingers twitched, betraying the restless energy beneath his calm facade. Then Thor moved, not with his usual thunderous fury, but with the grim determination of a man who'd run out of patience. One massive hand closed around Loki's throat, not squeezing, not yet, but the threat was clear. The air crackled with tension. "Confess," Thor growled, "or I'll let Odin decide what to carve from your lying ribs." The gods circled closer, their fading strength forgotten in the heat of the moment. Even Baldur, gentle Baldur, watched with ice in his gaze. Loki's eyes darted between them, calculating, weighing the cost of lies against the cost of truth. Then, with a laugh that sounded more like a snarl, he broke. "Fine, you want your precious Iunn back. She's in Thjazi's clutches, locked in a fortress where even your ravens won't find her, unless I lead you there." His confession wasn't remorseful, it was a bargaining chip tossed onto the table with a smirk. The revelation hit like a winter gale, betrayal, not just of Iunn, but of every oath, every shared cup, every bloody battle fought side by side. Odin's grip on Gungnir tightened, his knuckles white. "You'll retrieve her," he said, voice colder than Niflheim's deepest pit. "Not for forgiveness. For survival." And here's the cruel twist. Loki, for all his cunning, had underestimated the one thing that bound the gods tighter than magic or mead, their collective fury. They weren't just a council of deities now, they were a pack, and Loki had just proven himself the weakest link. The game had changed, the reckoning had begun. And somewhere in Jotunheim, a golden-haired goddess waited, her apples growing heavier with every passing second. Loki's grin faltered as the circle of gods tightened around him, their eyes burning with something colder than rage betrayal. He'd expected anger, even violence, but the quiet calculation in Odin's stare was worse. The Allfather's voice, when it came, was deceptively soft. "You'll bring her back," he said, fingers tracing the runes on Gungnir. "Not because we ask, because there's no other path left for you." The trickster's mind raced, weighing escape routes like a fox in a snare. Fleeing now would doom him to an eternity of pursuit, hunted by Thor's thunder and Heimdall's all-seeing gaze. But cooperation, that came with its own perils. Thjazi wasn't some brute to be outwitted. He was a storm given flesh, with a grudge as deep as Yggdrasil's roots. Loki swallowed, the taste of mead suddenly sour on his tongue. "I'll need tools," he muttered, already scheming. "Freyja's falcon cloak, and your oath that no blade touches my back once she's returned." The gods exchanged glances. Trusting Loki was like grasping a serpent by the tail, necessary but never safe. Yet time was a tide retreating from their shores, and every moment drained more strength from their bones. Thor, his once mighty biceps now gaunt beneath his armor, was the first to nod. "Bring her home," he growled, "and I'll spare your lying throat for now." Even the promise of vengeance had lost its heat, proof of how far they'd already fallen. Loki's plan was pure chaos wrapped in cunning. He'd use Freyja's enchanted cloak to soar into Thjazi's fortress, shape-shift into a nut to slip past the giant's guards, then whisper to Iunn the secret of turning herself into a feather, light enough to carry, small enough to hide. But here's where the gamble turned deadly. Thjazi would chase them, and when he did, Loki would lead him straight into Asgard's wrath. The gods agreed through clenched teeth. They hated relying on Loki's tricks, hated the smug glint in his eyes as he outlined his plan. But hatred, like pride, was a luxury they could no longer afford. As Loki fastened the falcon cloak around his shoulders, Odin leaned in, his breath a winter gust against the trickster's ear. "Fail," he whispered, "and I'll carve the lies from your tongue before the end finds us all." Loki's laugh was razor-thin as he took to the skies, the weight of his bargain heavier than any chain. For once, the stakes weren't just his life, they were the slow, creeping death of everything. And the cruelest twist, only the gods' greatest villain could now be their savior. Freyja's falcon cloak wasn't just a garment, it was a masterpiece of Seda magic, woven from feathers plucked from the wings of the first falcon ever to ride the winds of Yggdrasil. To wear it was to become the sky itself, shifting form with the ease of thought, slipping between realms as effortlessly as a whisper between lovers. Few artifacts in Asgard held such raw, untamed power, and fewer still were trusted to hands as unpredictable as Loki's. But desperate times make for strange alliances, and Freyja, her beauty now tinged with the faintest traces of age, handed it over with a warning. "Tarnish this," she said, her voice like a blade wrapped in silk, "and I'll carve the price from your flesh." The cloak's magic thrummed against Loki's shoulders as he fastened it, a current of energy that made his very bones hum. One moment he stood in Asgard's golden light, the next, his body dissolved into 1,000 feathers, his consciousness stretching into the keen, ruthless mind of a falcon. The transformation was dizzying, exhilarating. Where Loki's vision had once been bound by mortal limits, he now saw the sweat on a spider's web 3 valleys away, heard the heartbeat of a mouse burrowed deep beneath the snow. This wasn't just flight, it was dominion over the air itself, and that's exactly what he'd need to breach Thjazi's fortress. Giants might guard their gates with boulders and frost, but no wall could stop the wind. Loki's wings cut through the icy currents of Jotunheim like knives, his feathered form a shadow against the bruised purple sky. The cloak didn't just grant speed, it granted cunning. Every updraft, every gust became a tool in his grasp, bending to his will as he circled the jagged peaks where Thjazi had hidden Iunn. Here's the brilliance of Freyja's gift. It wasn't just a means of travel. It was a weapon of subtlety. Giants expect warriors to crash through their doors, hammers raised, not a whisper of feathers on the breeze. Loki's true advantage wasn't strength, it was the arrogance of his enemies. Thjazi had prepared for siege, for thunder and fire. He hadn't prepared for a thief who moved like the last breath of winter. Yet even with such power, the mission teetered on a knife's edge. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and the cloak's magic would unravel, leaving Loki stranded in the heart of enemy territory, and Freyja's promise of vengeance would be the least of his worries. The winds of Jotunheim howled like starving wolves, sharp enough to flay skin from bone. Loki's falcon form rode the currents, each gust carrying the scent of iron and ancient frost, a land where even the air felt hostile. Below him, the earth twisted into jagged spires of black rock, their peaks clawing at the blood-red sky as if trying to tear down the heavens themselves. Rivers of glacial melt cut through valleys too deep for sunlight to reach, their waters thick with grinding ice. This wasn't just a realm of giants, it was a living nightmare sculpted from rage and winter. Every beat of Loki's wings was a gamble. Giant eagles circled in the distance, their eyes sharp enough to spot a hare blinking from 3 leagues away. The occasional tremor shook the earth as mountain-sized Jotun trudged through the wastes, their footsteps cracking the frozen ground like eggshells. One wrong move, a reflected glint of sunlight, a shadow cast too boldly, and Thjazi's sentinels would be upon him. The falcon cloak didn't just hide Loki, it made him a ghost in the wind, slipping between layers of reality like a needle through cloth. Then he saw it, Thjazi's stronghold, a fortress hewn from a single, monstrous tooth of the world serpent, its arched gates lined with icicles as long as spears. The walls pulsed with a sickly blue light, runes carved deep by hands larger than ship masts. This wasn't just a prison for Iunn, it was a vault built to contain magic itself. The air around it crackled with wards, spells woven so tightly they made Loki's borrowed feathers prickle. Even in falcon form, he could taste the cedar on his tongue, metallic and bitter, like licking a frost-covered blade. And yet, amid the desolation, a flicker of gold. High in the fortress's tallest spire, a window glowed with warmth against the eternal twilight. Loki's sharpened vision caught the faintest movement within, a flash of sun-bright hair, the curve of a hand reaching for something just out of frame. Iunn alive, trapped but not broken, the sight sent a jolt through him, not guilt, not quite, but the uneasy stir of a plan coming undone. Thjazi hadn't just stolen her, he'd made her a trophy in his hall of horrors. Loki banked sharply, diving toward the fortress's blind spot, a crumbling parapet where the wards thinned like worn thread. The real test wouldn't be entering the stronghold. It would be surviving what waited inside. Thjazi's fortress wasn't built, it was grown, a nightmare of ice and iron fused into the spine of the mountains. Towers twisted like frozen screams, their jagged peaks piercing the sky as if to stab the stars themselves. The walls shimmered with a deceptive beauty, their glacial surfaces reflecting the aurora's ghostly dance, but beneath that glitter lay something far darker. Every stone hummed with cedar, the magic not just woven into the fortress but bred into it, as if the very rock had been taught to hate intruders. The air smelled of lightning and old blood, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like a warning. And at its heart, in a chamber carved from a single block of black ice, sat Iunn. The goddess of youth was a flicker of gold in a world of blue-black shadows. Her wrists were bound not with chains but with threads of winter wind, their touch leaving her skin raw and tinged with frost. The apple she'd once carried so lightly now sat across the room on a pedestal of bone, gleaming mockingly just out of reach. Thjazi hadn't just stolen her, he'd turned her into a living symbol of his victory. Every day he'd stride into that frozen hall, his breath frosting the air as he loomed over her. "Watch," he'd rumble, plucking an apple from the pile and taking a deliberate bite, his lips curling as the magic surged through him. He wasn't just consuming the fruit, he was consuming time, the very essence the gods had hoarded for millennia. Iunn's despair was quieter but deeper. It wasn't the cold or the hunger that wore her down, it was the silence, the absence of Broggi's songs, of Idavol's laughter, of the simple rhythm of her daily walks through Asgard's orchards. Here, the only sounds were the groan of shifting ice and the distant shrieks of Thjazi's eaglekin circling the peaks. She'd tried pleading at first, then defiance, but the giant only laughed, his voice like a glacier cracking. "Your gods are withering," he'd sneer, tracing a talon along her cheek. "Soon they'll be too weak to lift a sword, let alone storm my gates, the worst part." He wasn't wrong. Each sunset that stained the ice red marked another day the Aesir faded, their power leaching away like color from old tapestry. Iunn could feel it in her bones, a dull ache that had nothing to do with the cold. Her magic was tied to theirs, and as they weakened, so did she. The golden apples, once vibrant as summer sun, now dulled slightly with each passing hour, their glow dimming like embers in ash. Yet even in that frozen hell, Iunn clung to one truth: the gods would come, not out of love for her, though some might feel it, but because without her, their reign was a sandcastle at high tide. What she didn't know was that their rescue would wear the face of betrayal itself, and Thjazi, for all his arrogance, hadn't accounted for the storm that was coming, not the thunder of Thor, but the silent, deadly swoop of Falcon's wings. Loki's wings sliced through the frigid Jotunheim air as he circled Thjazi's fortress, his falcon eyes mapping every crack in the ice-laden walls. Speed wouldn't be enough to breach the stronghold. This required a performance worthy of his silver-tongued reputation. Landing silently on a crumbling ledge, he let the falcon cloak fall away, his form shimmering as he became something far smaller, far more inconspicuous, a single snowflake indistinguishable from the storm swirling around the fortress. Drifting through a gap in the fortress's wards, Loki rematerialized in the shadows of a storeroom cluttered with giant-sized provisions. Barrels of pickled whale meat towered like buildings, sacks of grain could have housed whole villages. The air reeked of fermented mammoth milk and iron-typical giant fare. But Loki wasn't here to raid the pantry. With a flick of his wrist, he plucked a hair from his own head, whispering a spell as it twisted into a perfect replica of one of Iunn's golden apples. The illusion was flawless, right down to the faint pulse of magic beneath its skin. Now came the dangerous part. Shifting his form once more, Loki melted into the likeness of a haggard servant, a stooped, frostbitten creature who wouldn't warrant a second glance from the giants. Limping into the halls, he made his way toward the spire where Iunn was kept, muttering about spoiled fruit and the master's displeasure. When he reached her chamber, the guards, two hulking Jotun with breath like blizzards, barely glanced at him as he shuffled inside, clutching the fake apple like a reluctant errand boy. Iunn's head snapped up as he entered, her eyes widening in recognition. Loki pressed a finger to his lips, then held out the decoy. A trade, he croaked in the servant's voice, loud enough for the guards to hear. "The master demands the freshest fruit. With a sleight of hand so smooth it defied even divine eyes, he swapped the fake for a real apple from the pedestal, tucking the precious artifact into his rags. Then, leaning close, he whispered truths only she would understand. When the storm comes, become the wind. No sooner had the words left his mouth than the fortress alarms roared to life. Loki had ensured his entrance wouldn't go unnoticed earlier. His falcon form had accidentally grazed a ward near Thjazi's throne room, sending ripples through the magic that guarded the stronghold. The giant's bellow shook the walls as the guards outside scrambled, torn between their post and the chaos unfolding below. Loki didn't wait. Shedding the servant's guise, he seized Iunn's hand and pressed Freyja's cloak into her grasp. "Turn yourself into something light," he urged. "A feather, a petal, anything that can ride the air." As she focused, her form dissolving into a single golden leaf, Loki's grin turned feral. The final act of the play was upon them, and Thjazi, for all his might, was about to learn why no one out-tricked the trickster. With Iunn's essence tucked safely into the folds of the cloak, Loki burst from the chamber, not as a falcon, but as a wildfire, a raging inferno that sent the remaining guards reeling. The diversion wouldn't last, but it didn't need to. By the time Thjazi realized the fire was yet another illusion, Loki and his precious cargo would already be soaring toward Asgard, the giant's roars of fury fading behind them like thunder in the distance. Yet even in triumph, Loki's mind raced ahead. Rescuing Iunn was one thing. Surviving the god's wrath and Thjazi's vengeance would be an entirely different game. The moment Thjazi's bellow shook the fortress walls, Loki knew their time had run out. Iunn's fingers tightened around the falcon cloak, her form flickering between terror and resolve. Now, Loki hissed, and with a breath that carried the weight of centuries of trickery, he blew across her palm, not gently like a lover's caress, but with the precision of a craftsman shaping fate itself. Iunn's body contorted, her golden hair and pale robes collapsing inward as if sucked into a vortex, until all that remained in Loki's palm was a single walnut, its shell gleaming with a faint, otherworldly sheen. Thjazi's roar turned the air to knives as he burst into the chamber, his massive frame filling the doorway like a storm-given flesh. His eyes, twin pits of winter fury, swept the empty room, the toppled pedestal, the scattered bones of his feast, the absence where his prize had been. The realization hit him like a falling mountain. His nostrils flared, catching the lingering scent of Asgard's magic, the oily residue of Loki's satyr clinging to the frost like snake tracks in sand. Loki didn't wait for the giant's wrath to find him. Clutching the walnut tight, he threw himself toward the nearest window, shifting mid-leap into a falcon once more. The cloak's feathers sliced through the blizzard winds as he shot into the open sky, but Thjazi was faster. With a snap of his wings, each pinion as wide as a longship, the giant gave chase, his shadow swallowing the landscape below. The mountains trembled as he took flight, his scream unraveling into a sound beyond rage, beyond vengeance. It was the cry of a predator who'd tasted godhood and found it ripped from his jaws. The chase that followed was a dance of death across the frozen wastes. Loki twisted between ice spires, using his smaller size to slip through gaps Thjazi's bulk couldn't follow. But the giant had the storm itself on his side. Hailstones the size of fists pummeled the falcon's wings. Gusts howled like grieving spirits, threatening to hurl Loki into the jagged teeth of the peaks below. Every near miss sent vibrations through the walnut in his talons, Iunn's essence pulsing in time with his frantic heartbeat. Then came the moment that nearly ended it all. Thjazi's talons grazed Loki's tail feathers, slicing through the magic like a hot blade through snow. The falcon screamed a sound too human for any bird as pain lanced up his spine. For a heartbeat he faltered, his wings buckling under the weight of the giant's hatred. But Loki had survived worse. With a snarl that would have made Thor proud, he tucked the walnut against his breast and dove, not away but down, straight into the belly of a crack splitting the glacier below. Thjazi's momentum carried him past, his wings too vast to follow into the crevasse. His shriek of frustration shook loose avalanches from the peaks, burying the valley in white fury. But Loki was already gone, swallowed by the glacier's shadows, the walnut safe in his grasp. The giant wheeled in the sky, his rage echoing across Jotunheim, but his prey had vanished like mist in sunlight. And so the trickster fled, not with a victor's grin, but with the grim focus of a man who knew the true battle lay ahead. Thjazi's wrath was a wildfire, yes, but the fury of the gods, betrayed and teetering on the edge of oblivion. That would be an inferno even Loki might not survive. The skies above Midgard became a battleground of feathers and fury as Thjazi's massive eagle form tore through the clouds, his wingspan blotting out the sun. Wind howled in his wake, twisting into violent spirals that sent Loki's falcon form tumbling like a leaf in a gale. The walnut containing Iunn's essence trembled in Loki's talons, its delicate shell slick with ice from the giant's freezing breath. Each beat of Thjazi's wings closed the distance between them, his shrieks shaking the very branches of Yggdrasil. This wasn't just a chase, it was a reckoning, the fury of the betrayed given wings. From the high towers of Asgard, the gods watched with breath held tight in their throats. Odin's single eye burned with a mixture of hope and fury, his grip on Gungnir turning his knuckles white. Thor, his once boundless strength now waning, leaned against the ramparts, his hammer Mjolnir humming with restless energy. Even Frigg, usually so composed, clutched the edge of her cloak as if she could will Loki's wings to move faster. The sight was terrifyingly clear. If Thjazi caught them, it wouldn't just be Iunn lost, it would be the last flicker of Asgard's defiance crushed beneath the giant's talons. Loki twisted mid-flight, darting between jagged mountain peaks to throw Thjazi off his trail. The giant's talons scraped stone, sending avalanches roaring into the valleys below. For a moment, it seemed the trickster might slip free until a gust of wind, thick with cedar, slammed into him like an invisible fist. The impact sent Loki spiraling, the walnut nearly slipping from his grasp. Thjazi's laughter was a thunderclap of triumph. He'd woven the very air itself into a snare, turning Loki's greatest ally, the sky, against him. Yet desperation breeds invention. As Thjazi reared back for the killing strike, Loki did the one thing the giant wouldn't expect. He stopped fleeing. Instead, he folded his wings and dropped like a stone, plummeting straight toward the roiling sea below. The sudden dive left Thjazi overshooting, his massive bulk unable to pivot fast enough. Salt spray stung Loki's feathers as he skimmed the waves, the ocean's surface a mirror reflecting the chaos above. But Thjazi wasn't so easily shaken. With a snap of his wings, he wheeled back, his yellow eyes locking onto his prey with murderous focus. In Asgard, the tension boiled over. Thor roared for Heimdall to sound the Gjala horn, to rally what strength they had left. Odin's ravens streaked across the sky, their frantic cries lost in the storm. The gods weren't just spectators now. They were prisoners of their own fragility, forced to rely on the one being they trusted least. And as Thjazi's shadow swallowed Loki once more, the unthinkable dawned on them. They might already be too late. The gods of Asgard weren't merely waiting, they were preparing. As Loki's falcon form streaked across the sky with Thjazi's monstrous shadow closing in, Odin's command sent the Aesir scrambling like soldiers before a siege. Thor, though weakened, hauled logs as thick as tree trunks into a pyre at the center of Idavol Plain. His breaths labored but his hands steady. Heimdall stacked kindling with the precision of a man who could hear the exact moment the giant would cross into their realm. Even Freyja, her famed beauty now touched by the faintest lines of strain, worked silently beside them, her fingers weaving strands of cedar into the wood itself, magic that would make the flames burn hotter than Muspelheim's heart. This wasn't just a fire, it was a weapon disguised as desperation, a beacon meant to exploit the one weakness giants never outgrew, their arrogance. Thjazi's mistake wasn't his pursuit, it was his refusal to consider the possibility of a trap. As he crossed into Asgard's skies, his wings churning the air like a hurricane, the giant saw only what the gods wanted him to see: Loki faltering, the walnut slipping, victory within grasp. The pyre below burned bright, its flames licking the twilight, but to a being who'd stolen the very essence of divinity, a mortal fire was no more threatening than candlelight. He didn't notice the runes etched into the logs, glowing white-hot beneath the blaze, didn't sense the way the smoke curled unnaturally toward him, as if pulled by invisible hands. Thjazi dove, his talons outstretched, his scream of triumph shaking the leaves from Yggdrasil's branches, and then the world erupted. The moment his shadow passed over the flames, the pyre exploded upward in a column of blue fire, fueled by the combined magic of every god who still had strength to spare. The heat was no mere burn. It was annihilation, a force that seared feathers to ash and melted the frost from Thjazi's wings. The giant's shriek turned from fury to horror as the fire twisted around him like a living thing, its hungry tongues lashing his body, his wings, his face. He flailed, trying to climb back into the safety of the sky, but the magic held him like chains, dragging him down into the inferno. Loki, wheeling above the chaos, watched as the flames consumed the giant who'd thought himself invincible. Thjazi's body blackened, his wings crumbling like charred parchment, his final roar becoming little more than a whisper lost in the crackle of the blaze. The gods hadn't just set a trap, they'd turned his own hunger against him. In his lust to reclaim what he'd stolen, the devourer had failed to see the feast for what it truly was, his funeral pyre. Yet even as the fire died to embers, the air thick with the acrid stench of burnt magic, no cheers rose from the gathered Aesir. Their eyes stayed locked on the smoldering remains, not in triumph but in grim understanding. This victory had come too close to disaster, and the walnut in Loki's talons, the last hope of their fading world, still had to reach its destination before the final spark of Asgard's power winked out. Thjazi's death wasn't just an end, it was a conflagration that seared itself into the memory of the Nine Realms. The giant's wings, once vast enough to blot out the sun, curled inward like burning parchment as the gods' enchanted flames devoured him. His screams echoed across Asgard, not with the roar of a predator, but the raw, guttural terror of a creature realizing too late that it had flown too close to divinity's wrath. The fire didn't merely consume him, it unraveled him, reducing his titanic form to embers that scattered on the wind like dying stars. Even the smoke seemed alive, twisting into shapes of eagles mid-swoop before dissipating into nothingness, a final, fleeting mockery of the hunter he'd been. For the Aesir, the relief was palpable but short-lived. Thor, his hands still trembling from the strain of lifting logs his weakened muscles could barely manage, slumped against a pillar, his chest heaving. Odin's single eye gleamed with something darker than triumph, the knowledge that this victory had come at too steep a cost. The gods weren't just diminished, they were fragile, their immortality hanging by the thinnest thread. As the last of Thjazi's ashes settled, the air itself seemed to shudder, as if the world tree Yggdrasil had exhaled a breath held too long. But vengeance, like fire, leaves embers. Thjazi's daughter, Skadi, arrived at Asgard's gates not with tears, but with a frost-rimmed silence colder than any winter. Clad in armor forged from glacial ice, her eyes mirrored the void between stars, empty of grief, full of purpose. The giants of Jotunheim might have been beaten, but their pride was unbroken. Skadi's presence was a promise, the blood debt would be paid. The gods, still gasping from their brush with mortality, understood the unspoken threat. This wasn't over, and yet for now there was Iunn. Loki, his feathers singed and his smirk frayed at the edges, landed heavily before the gathered Aesir, the walnut clutched in his talons. As he released it, the shell split with a sound like the first crack of spring ice, and Iunn tumbled forth not as a leaf or a feather, but as herself, her golden hair dimmed but unbroken. The apples spilled from her grasp, rolling across the scorched earth, their glow pulsing faintly like weary hearts. The gods reached for them with hands that shook not from weakness now, but from something far more dangerous, hope. The feast that followed was quieter than those of old, the mead laced with the bitter aftertaste of lessons learned. Loki, ever the outsider, lurked at the edges, his usual swagger muted. Even he couldn't spin this tale into a triumph. They'd survived, yes, but survival, as Thjazi's smoldering corpse proved, wasn't the same as winning. And somewhere beyond Asgard's shimmering walls, Skadi's footsteps crunched through the snow, each one a ticking clock counting down to the next storm. The first bite of Iunn's apple was like sunrise after an endless night. Thor's fingers, which had stiffened around Mjolnir's handle, unclenched with a sigh as warmth flooded his veins, muscle and sinew knitting back into their godly strength. Odin's eye, clouded with age just hours before, sharpened once more, the runes of his wisdom flaring bright in his mind like rekindled embers. Even Freyja's silver-streaked hair shimmered back to molten gold, the apple's magic weaving through her like a second dawn. The hall of Valhalla, so eerily quiet in their absence, erupted with a cacophony of laughter, mead horns clashing, and the sudden, vibrant strum of Broggi's harp as he swept his reclaimed wife into his arms. But the truest miracle wasn't just the return of their youth, it was the return of their certainty. For the first time since Iunn's disappearance, the gods moved without hesitation, without the creeping dread that each step might be their last. The golden apples weren't just sustenance, they were a reaffirmation of their place in the cosmos. The walls of Asgard seemed to breathe again, the very stones humming with renewed energy as if the realm itself had been holding its breath. Iunn, though, stood quietly amid the celebration, her hands still trembling. The ordeal had left its mark not on her body but on her spirit. She'd carried the weight of the gods' mortality in that frozen prison, felt every minute of their decay like a phantom chill in her bones. Now, as Broggi sang her praises and the Aesir toasted her name, she caught Loki's gaze across the hall, the trickster lingering in the shadows as always. His smirk was there, but thinner now, strained at the edges. They both knew the truth. Her apples could restore flesh, but not trust, not the cracks this ordeal had left in Asgard's foundations. And so the feasting wore on, a defiant blaze against the gathering dark. The gods drank deep, their voices rising in songs that shook the rafters, but the undertone was new, a raw, jagged gratitude that bordered on desperation. They'd tasted mortality, and the flavor lingered, bitter as mead dregs. Even in triumph, the lesson clung. Immortality was never a right, it was a gift. One that could be stolen. Outside, beyond the glow of the hall, the first snows of Skadi's vengeance began to fall. Loki's smirk faded the moment the feasting halls fell silent. The gods might have their youth restored, but trust wasn't so easily mended. Odin's one eye, now sharp as ever, lingered on the trickster with a gaze that could strip bark from Yggdrasil. Thor's fingers flexed around Mjolnir's handle, the knuckles whitening, not from weakness this time, but restraint. Even Iunn, gentle as morning light, couldn't meet his eyes without a flicker of unease. The air in Asgard was thick with unspoken judgment. Loki had saved them, but he'd also damned them first. The debate that followed wasn't held in grand councils or beneath the world tree's boughs. It happened in glances, in the way the Aesir shifted their seats when Loki approached, in the half-empty mead horns left in his path. Some, like Broggi, argued for clemency without Loki's cunning. Iunn would still be trapped in Thjazi's frozen claws. Others, led by Thor's simmering rage, saw only the betrayal. A wolf doesn't earn praise for returning the sheep it stole. The thunder god growled, sparks dancing along Mjolnir's edge. Odin's verdict came not as a pronouncement but as a test. He tossed Loki a single golden apple, not from Iunn's basket but from his own private store. Eat, the Allfather commanded. The unspoken threat hung like mist. If Loki had poisoned the others, he'd suffer first. The trickster's laughter rang hollow as he bit into the fruit, the juice dripping like liquid sunlight down his chin. The gods watched, breath held, as moments passed without so much as a twitch. Only then did Odin nod, though his eye never lost its glacial chill. Leniency, it seemed, had its limits. Loki kept his head, but not his freedom. The Aesir bound him with oaths tighter than any chain, spells woven into his very blood. One misstep, one whispered lie too many, and the magic would coil around his throat like a hangman's rope. Even Freyja's falcon cloak, once freely given, was locked away in vaults deeper than Niflheim's roots. Yet the cruelest punishment wasn't the restrictions, it was the silence. Where once the halls had echoed with Loki's jibes and stories, now his voice seemed to evaporate before reaching anyone's ears. The gods drank, laughed, and schemed as if he were a ghost haunting their feast. And Loki, for all his silver tongue, found no words to bridge the gap. The lesson was clear. In Asgard, redemption wasn't earned with a single act, no matter how heroic. It was a currency paid in centuries of loyalty, and Loki's account was still emptier than a beggar's cup. For now, he remained the flame, dancing too close to the kindling warmth and destruction in equal measure, never fully trusted, never entirely cast out. And somewhere beyond the rainbow bridge, Skadi sharpened her ice blades, her vengeance a storm gathering on the horizon. The gods had their apples back, but the scars of Loki's betrayal would linger longer than any winter. Iunn's golden apples weren't just fruit, they were the pulsing heart of Norse cosmology. Unlike the ambrosia of Greek myths or the peaches of immortality in Chinese lore, these apples carried a uniquely Norse understanding of time. Not as a linear march toward doom, but as a cycle of decay and renewal, forever teetering on the edge of collapse yet perpetually reborn. Their magic didn't grant the gods eternal life in the way we might imagine it. Instead, it stitched them into the very fabric of Yggdrasil's endless turning, allowing them to withstand the erosion of ages without ever truly escaping it. Consider the apple's golden hue, not the dull shine of metal, but the living glow of sunlight trapped in fruit. This was no accident. Gold symbolized incorruptibility in Norse culture, a material that refused to tarnish even as iron rusted and wood rotted. Yet the apples weren't static treasures locked in a vault. They had to be consumed, digested, their essence metabolized anew with each passing season. Here lies the paradox at the core of Norse immortality. Permanence required constant renewal. The gods didn't simply possess eternal youth, they had to actively reclaim it bite by bite, a ritual as vital as the sunrise. The cyclical nature of this magic mirrored the Norse worldview. Just as the world tree Yggdrasil shed its leaves in autumn only to bud again in spring, just as Ragnarok's destruction promised rebirth, the apples forced the gods to confront a humbling truth: their divinity was borrowed. Without Iunn's gifts, they withered like mortal men, their power as fleeting as a frost melting under the midday sun. This wasn't just a plot device, it was a narrative embodiment of the Norse fear of entropy, the creeping dread that even the mightiest realms could crumble if not tended. The apples also held a darker symbolism, one the myth lays bare through Iunn's kidnapping. When stolen, their absence didn't just weaken the gods, it unraveled them. Thor's muscles atrophied, Odin's wisdom scattered like leaves in a storm. Their decline wasn't graceful aging but a rapid collapse, exposing the fragile foundation of their supposed invincibility. The message was clear: immortality wasn't inherent to the gods, it was a fragile pact with forces beyond their control. Yet perhaps the most striking layer of meaning lies in who guarded these apples. Not a warrior like Thor or a seer like Odin, but Iunn, gentle, unassuming, often overlooked until crisis struck. Her role whispers a subversion of traditional power structures. True strength wasn't always in the swing of a hammer or the thrust of a spear. Sometimes it grew quietly on golden branches, tended by hands that wielded no weapons but held the fate of all things. The apples, then, become a metaphor for the invisible sustenance that upholds existence itself. The small, sacred things we take for granted until they're gone. And that's why this myth endures. It isn't just about magic fruit or divine politics. It's about the delicate balance that keeps worlds alive, the cyclical dance of loss and return that defines every realm, from Asgard's gleaming towers to the humblest human hearth. The apples remind us that immortality isn't the absence of death. It's the courage to keep reaching for the next harvest, knowing winter will always come again. The tale of Iunn's abduction echoes through mythologies across the world, a haunting refrain of stolen divinity and the fragile balance between life and decay. Take Persephone, the Greek goddess of spring, dragged into the underworld by Hades, her absence bringing winter's barren grip to the earth until her mother Demeter's grief forced her return. Like Iunn, Persephone's story is one of cyclical loss and rebirth, but where the Norse myth centers on the fear of aging and the desperation of gods clinging to power, the Greek version speaks to the natural rhythms of the earth itself. Persephone's time in the underworld isn't just a tragedy, it's the reason seasons exist, a cosmic compromise between death and renewal. Iunn's apples, by contrast, aren't tied to harvests or frosts. They're the lifeline of a pantheon terrified of irrelevance, a symbol of immortality as something actively fought for rather than passively inherited. Venture into Celtic lore and you'll find Blodeuwedd, the flower woman created as a bride for the hero Lord Gifs. When she betrays him, she's transformed into an owl, a punishment far crueler than Thjazi's fiery end, yet rooted in the same theme, the violation of sacred trust. Both myths grapple with the consequences of tampering with forces meant to sustain life, but where Blodeuwedd's tale is one of irreversible punishment, Iunn's return offers a fleeting hope that even the gravest betrayals can be mended, if only temporarily. The Celts saw betrayal as a fracture that could never fully heal. The Norse, ever pragmatic, understood that survival sometimes means swallowing your pride along with the golden fruit. Even beyond Europe, the pattern repeats. The Japanese sun goddess Amaterasu, who retreats into a cave after her brother's cruelty, plunging the world into darkness until lured out by laughter and dance. Her withdrawal mirrors Iunn's capture. Both are absences that unravel the natural order, leaving their kin weakened and desperate. But here's the twist: Amaterasu's return is orchestrated through joy, not force, a reminder that some forms of renewal require not just cunning or strength, but the rekindling of light itself. The Norse gods, by contrast, resort to fire and trickery, their salvation as brutal as their predicament. What binds these myths together isn't just the motif of abduction, it's the visceral fear of what happens when the guardians of vitality vanish. Whether it's Persephone's pomegranate seeds, Iunn's apples, or Amaterasu's mirror, each culture conjures a talisman of renewal, an object that bridges the gap between loss and return. But the Norse version stands apart in its starkness. There's no poetry in the gods' desperation, no allegory for the turning earth, just the raw, choking terror of time's weight pressing down on shoulders that had never imagined they could bend. Perhaps that's why Iunn's story lingers in the bones long after the tale is told. It isn't just about gods and giants, it's about the universal dread of dependence, the quiet horror of realizing how easily the things we rely on can be snatched away. Other myths offer solace in metaphor. The Norse, they hand you an apple and whisper, "Chew quickly, the night is coming." Loki's duality as both villain and savior isn't just a quirk of Norse mythology. It's the heartbeat of the trickster archetype found in cultures worldwide. These figures defy simple labels, slipping between chaos and order, destruction and creation, with a fluidity that both terrifies and fascinates. Think of Anansi, the West African spider god whose webs of deceit often weave the very fabric of human knowledge, or Coyote in Native American traditions, whose reckless antics bring fire to humanity even as his greed creates deserts. Tricksters don't just disrupt, they force systems to adapt, exposing hypocrisy and rigidity like a knife slicing through rotten fruit. Their mischief isn't mindless, it's a crucible that tests the strength of societies, gods, and even cosmic laws. What makes Loki's role in Iunn's kidnapping so compelling is how perfectly it encapsulates this paradox. Yes, he's the architect of the gods' downfall, bargaining away their immortality for his own skin. But without his treachery, the Aesir would never have confronted their fatal flaw. Their dependence on Iunn's apples wasn't just practical, it was existential. Loki's betrayal held up a mirror showing Odin and Thor their own fragility, and when he later rescues Iunn, it's not out of redemption, it's survival. Tricksters don't operate on morality, they operate on necessity, exposing truths too uncomfortable for heroes or kings to acknowledge. Compare this to Japan's Susanoo, the storm god who wreaks havoc by uprooting rice fields and skinning sacred horses, yet also slays the serpent Yamata no Orochi to save a village. Or Greece's Prometheus, who steals fire from Zeus, an act of defiance that sparks human civilization. The pattern is universal. Tricksters break rules to reveal what those rules hide. In Norse myth, Loki's chaos forces the gods to innovate, whether forging new weapons or bargaining with giants. Without him, Asgard stagnates, its golden halls gilded cages. Yet there's a darker layer. Tricksters often pay the steepest price for their disruptions. Loki's binding after Iunn's rescue, his lips sewn shut with his son's entrails, parallels the fate of the Polynesian Maui, crushed beneath the goddess of death for attempting to steal immortality for humanity. Even Hermes, the most light-hearted of tricksters, must constantly prove his worth to Olympus. These punishments hint at a grim truth. Societies tolerate tricksters only up to a point. They're scapegoats as much as catalysts, bearing the blame for the chaos they reveal rather than the systems that spawned it. The brilliance of the trickster lies in their refusal to fit neatly into myths as either savior or villain. They're the lightning strike that ignites a forest fire, destructive, yes, but also clearing the way for new growth. Loki's role in Iunn's tale isn't just about apples or giants. It's about the uncomfortable dance between order and chaos that defines every world, mortal or divine. And that's why these figures endure, because deep down we recognize that progress often begins with a lie, a theft, or a god's desperate flight in falcon feathers. The story of Iunn and her golden apples wasn't just another myth to the Vikings. It was a cultural touchstone that shaped their understanding of life, power, and vulnerability. Across Scandinavia, artisans carved her likeness into pendant amulets and temple doors, often depicting her cradling the apples like a mother holding her child. These weren't mere decorations, they were talismans against decay, physical reminders that even the mightiest warriors and chieftains depended on forces beyond their strength. The famous Överhogdal tapestries, woven nearly 1,000 years ago, show a figure many scholars believe to be Iunn standing beside Yggdrasil, her outstretched hands offering fruit to gods and mortals alike, a rare visual bridge between the divine and human world. But the myth's influence runs deeper than art. Viking poetry, especially the skaldic verses recited in mead halls, used Iunn's apples as metaphors for both the fleeting nature of glory and the resilience of legacy. A warrior's deeds might fade like unrenewed youth, the skalds warned, but those who fed on metaphorical apples, honor, loyalty, cunning, could achieve a kind of immortality through song. This duality captures the Viking mindset perfectly, a celebration of strength tempered by the humbling knowledge that all things, even gods, wither without sustenance. Fast forward to modern times, and Iunn's legacy takes surprising turns. While Marvel's Thor comics and films reduced her to a minor character, often just Thor's aunt or a background goddess, her thematic essence quietly shaped bigger narratives. The super soldier serum in Captain America, a scientific echo of those golden apples, another attempt to stave off human fragility. Even the premise of Asgard's fall in Thor, Ragnarok mirrors the existential dread of Iunn's abduction. Without their source of power, even gods become mortal. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues about how deeply this myth was woven into daily life. Excavations at Uppsala, Sweden's great pagan temple site, revealed pits full of apple seeds mixed with animal bones, possible remnants of rituals pleading for vitality or rebirth. The poetic Edda describes Iunn's apples as renewers, and sure enough, Norse medical texts prescribed apples for healing, their flesh seen as a lesser mirror of her divine fruit. What makes Iunn's cultural footprint so fascinating is its paradox. She's simultaneously central and overlooked, her quiet presence in myths belying her enormous symbolic weight. Viking parents named daughters after her not for warlike glory, but for the hope of endurance. Farmers buried apples with their dead, a plea for renewal in the next life. And today, as modern heathens revive Norse traditions, her rituals are among the first restored proof that in a world still obsessed with defying time, the lesson of the golden apples remains as vital as ever. Immortality isn't about never fading. It's about knowing what nourishes your soul and fighting to keep it close. The myth of Iunn's kidnapping isn't just a thrilling tale, it's a mirror held up to the fragile foundations of power, trust, and the illusions of invincibility. At its core, the story forces us to confront a humbling truth. Even the mightiest depend on forces beyond their control. The gods of Asgard, for all their thunder and valor, were just one stolen basket away from collapse. Their immortality wasn't an inherent trait. It was a borrowed privilege, a gift that could be revoked as swiftly as a giant's talons snatching light from the sky. This isn't just a lesson about divine vulnerability. It's a reminder of how easily we mistake dependency for strength in our own lives. Whether it's the systems we rely on, the relationships we nurture, or the routines that sustain us, the myth whispers a warning. Take nothing for granted, because even the golden apples can vanish. Trust in this story is both the first casualty and the final redemption. Loki's betrayal cuts deep not because he's evil, but because he's family, a blood brother to Odin, a companion at the feast. His deceit exposes the razor's edge between loyalty and survival, forcing us to ask, how far would we go to save ourselves if the stakes were high enough? Yet the story doesn't end with punishment alone. Loki's eventual role in Iunn's rescue complicates the moral, suggesting that trust, once broken, can still be a tool, if not a bond. The gods don't forgive him, they use him, binding his tricks to their survival. There's a brutal pragmatism here. Sometimes the hand that stabs you is the only one that can stitch the wound. The myth also lays bare the consequences of deceit, not just for the liar, but for the entire web of relationships around them. Loki's betrayal doesn't just harm Iunn, it unravels Asgard itself. Thor's strength fades, Odin's wisdom scatters, the golden halls grow dim as if the realm itself is grieving. Deception here isn't a solitary act, it's a stone thrown into a pond, its ripples touching shores the thrower never intended. This echoes a universal truth: lies don't exist in isolation. They fracture communities, erode foundations, and force even the innocent to pay the price. The gods' collective panic isn't just about lost immortality, it's about realizing how deeply interconnected their fates truly are. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is the fragility of order itself. Norse mythology is obsessed with cycles: creation and destruction, winter and spring, life and Ragnarok. Iunn's apples symbolize the precarious balance that holds back chaos, and their theft reveals how thin that balance really is. One moment the gods are eternal, the next they're gasping like mortals, their divinity leaking away like sand through clenched fists. This isn't just a divine drama, it's a metaphor for the systems we build in our own lives. Careers, relationships, even personal health can seem unshakable until a single crisis exposes their fragility. The myth doesn't offer reassurance, it offers clarity. Order isn't default, it's a choice, a practice, a constant tending. Yet amid these dark truths, there's an unexpected thread of hope. Iunn's return doesn't just restore the gods' youth, it reaffirms the possibility of renewal. The apple's magic isn't a one-time blessing, it's a seasonal ritual, a recurring act of faith. this cyclical renewal suggests that collapse isn't always the end. Sometimes it's the necessary prelude to rebuilding. The gods don't emerge from this ordeal unchanged. They're wiser, wearier, but also more aware of their interdependence. There's a humility in their feasting afterward, a recognition that their golden age isn't a given. It's a collective effort as delicate and vital as the first buds of spring. The story's enduring power lies in its refusal to simplify. It doesn't villainize Loki entirely or sanctify the gods. Instead, it paints a world where motives are muddied, where saviors and betrayers wear the same face, and where the things we rely on most are often the things we notice least. That's the final, piercing lesson. Pay attention to the quiet guardians in your life, the people, habits, and small sanctuaries that sustain you, because one day you might look up and realize their absence is the only thing powerful enough to make you tremble. The myth of Iunn's kidnapping and rescue is a whirlwind of betrayal, desperation, and the fragile threads that hold even gods together. It begins with Loki, ever the agent of chaos, striking a deal with the giant Thjazi, trading the goddess of youth for his own survival. With silver-tongued deception, he lures Iunn beyond Asgard's safety, straight into the clutches of a predator who craves the power of her golden apples. The consequences are immediate and terrifying. The gods wither, their immortality draining like sand through an hourglass, their golden halls growing dim as panic sets in. Yet the story doesn't end in despair. Loki, bound by oaths and self-preservation, becomes the unlikely savior. Donning Freyja's falcon cloak, he soars into Thjazi's frozen fortress, outwitting the giant with the same cunning that doomed the gods in the first place. The rescue is a spectacle of trickery. Iunn transformed into a feather, Thjazi lured into Asgard's trap, his wings burning away in enchanted flames, and just like that, the balance is restored. The gods feast again, their youth renewed, but the scars of the ordeal linger. Trust is fractured. Loki's punishment is swift and brutal, a reminder that even the most necessary betrayals come at a cost. But here's the haunting question at the heart of it all. Could the gods have survived without Loki? His treachery set the crisis in motion, yet his ingenuity brought Iunn home. The myth forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that chaos and order aren't always opposites. Sometimes they're partners in a deadly dance. Without the trickster's cunning, would Asgard have found another way, or was this a reckoning they needed to face? What do you think? Was Loki a villain, a savior, or something far more complicated? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into Norse mythology's most gripping tale of survival, don't forget to like and subscribe for more myths, legends, and the timeless lessons they carry. The stories are waiting, and the next adventure is just a click away.